Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Klien from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. This is the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and helpful concepts for the study of communication. This video is going to try to take on a really complex and thorny set of issues regarding the intersection of cultural identity, power, and privilege. In previous videos in this series, we've taken a look at how our processes of perception, the ways in which we take in and assign meaning to the things that we encounter in the world, not only help us define and understand our self-concept, but also the ways in which we understand other people. And so what we need to do is to think about how the ways in which we develop senses of identity contribute not only to a really rich and meaningful way of understanding ourselves as part of larger communities that share certain important things in common, but also how the development of these identities, if we're not careful, and the historical record demonstrates amply that we are often very uncareful in this dimension, we can use our own social and cultural identities in a way that separates and divides. And indeed, when we take this kind of exclusionary approach to identity and we bring to that the power that's involved in important social institutions, we find ourselves with the roots for some really important and even dangerous societal problems. However, the great thing about understanding communication and its relationship to culture and to power is that once we have a better understanding and a better appreciation for the issues involved, we have the tools that are necessary to take some important steps to try to rectify some of the problems of inequality and power imbalances in our society, and to try to achieve what all of us really want to achieve, and that is to live a life that is individually and mutually satisfying, to be able to accomplish our goals and live in ways that enrich us without necessarily having to feel that it comes at the expense of somebody else. Now, how do we do that? Well, first we need to make sure that we recall some important concepts that we've discussed in previous videos in this series. First of all is the idea of identity, the characteristics and attributes that define who a person or group is. It's important to remember that identity is not something that's solely individual and isolated. There is a personal dimension to identity, but we also have a sense of social identity, who we are in terms of the social groups that we happen to affiliate with, and the commitment we have to those groups through the interpersonal interactions we have with those that are also members of these groups. And we also have a sense of cultural identity, which goes above and beyond the kinds of things that are possible through the social identity we develop through affiliated groups. Understanding culture as the ongoing negotiation of learned and patterned beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors is a really important way to help provide a foundation for understanding the rest of these issues related to it. Cultural identity is really based on socially constructed categories that teach us a way of being and include expectations for social behavior or ways of acting. From the time that we're born, we find ourselves within a particular cultural group. That cultural group has existed long before we were born, and over the course of history has developed a whole host of ways of thinking about the world, ways of thinking about ourselves, and how we intersect and interact with other people and otherwise act in the world. So in addition to nationality and ethnicity, we can think about regional cultural identities, we can think about race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, ability and disability, and socioeconomic class. All of these can be considered cultural groups. Starting from this foundation, we can then start to really get a sense of the kinds of things that can complicate what happens when members of different cultural groups interact. One of the important things that can help us figure out what cultural identity means is to think about it in terms of in-groups and out-groups. The definitions for these concepts are relatively self-explanatory. When we think about an in-group, we think about members of a social group that share perceived definitive similarities. And of course, then by extension, out-groups are identifiable social or cultural groups that fall outside the in-group. So we think about our social identity, and importantly, we think about our cultural identity in terms of this kind of us versus them identity. Now, it's important to note that there's nothing necessarily or inherently problematic with thinking about us and them as senses of difference. Indeed, taking the position that ultimately we're all human beings and we're all the same, which is true in a really high elevation sense, and is an important assumption to make for some important moral and ethical assumptions about life. But if that's all we choose to think about, then we're really erasing some of the important differences that exist between groups of people, and those differences can be important in some very positive ways, as opposed to very negative ways. So in-group and out-group is not necessarily a problematic distinction. But here's where it gets problematic. First of all, we need to start thinking about stereotypes. Now, when we try to understand other groups of people, particularly those that are outside of our own cultural identity, our experiences may be potentially limited, and the ways in which we interpret the experiences we have with those in outgroups may themselves be influenced by previous norms and assumptions from people in my own cultural identity. And so this is where stereotypes can develop. Stereotypes essentially are overgeneralized, oversimplified, and often inaccurate images of and beliefs about another group. And so while it's almost impossible to think about social groups and cultural groups without thinking about what kinds of ways of being or what kinds of identity characteristics make one group different than another group, it's impossible to not think about those terms. Those kinds of things can be really helpful for us in helping us understand our own culture and other cultures. The problem comes from when these kinds of assumptions are overly generalized and overly simplified, and they're really not based on an accurate sense of who people actually are. Now, we're all probably very familiar of circumstances where some really nasty and sometimes even cruel stereotypes are used overtly and consciously by people in order to try to establish themselves as superior over others that they perceive are inferior. But that's not the only, and arguably it's not even the most important way in which stereotypes and other negative perceptions of outgroups can manifest themselves. In recent years, the notion of implicit bias has become increasingly important in helping us think about the problems that happen when we try to understand and draw conclusions about people from outgroups. Implicit bias refers to preferences, attitudes, and other perceptions we have toward people without our conscious knowledge. When we encounter people from a racial group or a different gender identity or someone who has a different ability or disability status compared to ours, we often engage in the process of overgeneralizations and stereotyping at a level of cognition that we're really not thinking about. And the reason that we're really not thinking about it, but it's still happening, is because we're so embedded in our own familiar and comfortable cultural norms and assumptions. And that's a completely natural and rational process on one level. If the ways in which we learn about the world are incredibly influenced by our cultural experiences and the lessons that we learn from our own culture and interacting with others, then the manifestation of implicit bias is something that, well, it would be really surprising if it didn't happen. Now, implicit bias and stereotyping by themselves can cause some significant problems, but they get amplified incredibly once you bring power into the mix. Power, very simply defined, is the ability to influence others and control our lives. Now, before we go any further, it is important to point out that just like the idea of cultural identity establishing in-groups and out-groups, us and them, power is not necessarily something that in and of itself is always going to be a negative thing. On the other hand, it's not going to always be a positive thing as well. Power is just an overall term to refer to the variety of different resources that we have that enable us to accomplish things and do the things that we want to do. And quite often, that involves processes of social influence through communication, as well as being able to control the material and social and cultural circumstances of our lives. We need to refer to one final distinction that was established in a previous video in this series, and that's the distinction between society and culture. We often use these terms synonymously, but they really apply to different ways of understanding groups of people. When we think about society, we're thinking about a community's organizational infrastructure, how that group of people actually does things based on such elements as geographic space, political and legal systems, economy and commerce, and other important institutions. How is it that people are able to do the things that they want to do and need to do within the community group? Society provides the systems and the institutions and the infrastructure in order for that to get done. On the other hand, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about a community's core beliefs, values, rules, and expectations. How is it that we understand who we are individually as well as within the cultural group, and what does that mean for how we should behave? And so we look to such resources of cultural learning as religion and philosophy, arts and sciences, behavioral norms, and dominant communication practices. Now, while society and culture are different, it's impossible to overstate the importance of society and culture interweaving with one another in the ways in which groups of people act and interact in larger human communities. So, for instance, whether we're thinking on a social identity level or a cultural identity level, one thing that's important when you bring power into the mix are distinctions between dominant identities and non-dominant identities. Simply put, groups that possess a dominant identity have historically had and currently have more resources and influence compared to those who possess a non-dominant identity, who historically have had and currently have less resources and influence. So we can see that while two different groups of people are going to have different sorts of cultural identities, those different cultural identities are going to have increased salience and resonance if one of those cultural identities also has a dominant space in society. So, for instance, we see this in traditions with regard to racism, where those with a white identity have historically had and currently have more resources and influence from political and economic and social standpoints compared to groups that are persons of color who historically have had and currently have less resources and influence. And we see the same kind of thing with regard to gender inequities. Traditions of historical sexism have constructed men as having a dominant identity and a real power advantage compared to women who have had to work extra hard in order to try to minimize that gap. Now, it's important to remember as well that while we can think about social and cultural identities in terms of dominant and non-dominant, it needs to be more complex than that, because we don't just have one cultural identity or one social identity. Another crucially important concept that has taken increased importance in recent years is the notion of intersectionality. Simply put, our identities are made up of multiple identity dimensions. We certainly think about our social identities in terms of a number of different social groups with which we're affiliated. We are members of families. We are members of workplaces. We attend specific schools. We are citizens of particular political communities, be they towns or states or nations. And we also have a number of different cultural identities at the same time. I can be white and male and someone from a middle to upper middle class socioeconomic background, and I can possess all of those identities at the same time. And so what's important about this is that multiple systems of power and oppression can operate on individuals in various degrees that directly corresponds to their identity. Now, this can seem a little odd to wrap our heads around in the abstract, so we can think about it with some concrete examples. Consider Randy. On the one hand, Randy is a white male and he comes from an upper class socioeconomic background, so in many ways he possesses dominant identities and potentially has a number of power advantages relative to others in the society. However, at the same time, Randy is also disabled, and so there are some ways in which he possesses a non-dominant identity compared to someone like Addison, who doesn't have a disability. And so, with regard to ability and disability, Addison possesses a dominant identity relative to Randy. However, Addison, who is a woman and who, for the sake of this illustration, is someone comes from a working class socioeconomic background, is going to have a non-dominant identity as compared to Randy. Now, Chantel, who's a doctor, may be potentially in the same socioeconomic class as Randy, and so might be dominant with regard to Chantel on that level, but on the other hand, she's a woman and she's also black. And so as a black woman, that intersectionality is going to put her in a position where she is at once on the same general level of identity power as Addison with regard to gender. She's going to be in a non-dominant position when it comes to the race that Addison and Randy share. Now, Arif may, in outward appearance, present as a white male, but if you were to know that Arif is a Muslim and an immigrant, those identities are going to put him in a non-dominant position relative to the rest of the folks that we've seen so far, who are natural-born U.S. citizens and whose religious identity might identify as Christian. So in some ways, Arif is going to be dominant. In some ways, he's going to have a non-dominant dimension. And then, of course, here's Ursula, who, as a multiracial woman, someone who is also gay, has a variety of ways in which she's going to have non-dominant power gaps compared to some of the other folks at this table, while at the other hand, she'll have some relative advantages over some of the other dimensions. In other words, this gets messy. But what's important to think about is that none of us exist as an isolated, oversimplified cultural identity. We exist in an intersectional matrix of multiple identities. And at different times, in different contexts, these intersectional identities are going to result in various forms of power, either being used against us or perhaps benefiting others and not us. Now, among the many systems in human communities that makes a lot of this power dynamic pretty invisible is the notion of ideology. Ideology is a coherent, integrated system of multiple interrelated social and cultural and political thoughts, beliefs, and values. Any human community that shares an important social or cultural identity inevitably over time is going to develop an overarching ideology because of the ways in which we have shared identity and the ways in which we learn about what that shared identity means from past history, past cultural examples, the passing down of norms and expectations and rules for what counts as normal, what counts as ideal, and what counts as different or abnormal or other. And the thing that makes ideology powerful is that it's the taken for granted, residing in the background of our minds that we just assume is the way that reality is. The power of ideology is that we don't necessarily recognize it. And this is especially important when we consider what might be termed an ideology of domination, a system of thought in which it seems natural and normal to many that some people or groups will always have power over others. Because of the combination of the cultural rules and norms and expectations that we have, especially those who reside within a dominant cultural identity, And you pair that with the systemic and structural institutions of a society that enable and perpetuate certain kinds of power imbalances, it starts to become taken for granted that there are going to be some people that are just inherently advantaged over other people, and that's just the way it is. One of the things that can make an ideology of domination especially painful is that dominant cultural norms can be internalized by non-dominant cultural groups. In other words, some of the kinds of oppression that comes from a power differential based on cultural dominance isn't always going to be the dominant group expressly and overtly imposing their will over the non-dominant group. But instead, the non-dominant group, who gets to observe from the outside the relative power advantage and all of the benefits that go along with it, may even start themselves to see that those kinds of cultural norms and beliefs and expectations held by the dominant group are actually those that ought to be preferred because they get associated with dominant power and advantage. One really poignant illustration of this idea comes from the 2005 short documentary film A Girl Like Me. A Girl Like Me was produced by a black teenager, Kiri Davis, who wanted to explore beauty and self-concept issues faced by black teen girls due to the beauty standards established by dominant white culture. And there are a variety of sources for this dominant culture. Parts of it date all the way back to the historical legacies of slavery. Others get established by contemporary norms for beauty established by the media culture. And what A Girl Like Me does is illustrate how young girls have to grapple with the distinction and the real important cultural power gap between these beauty standards and their lived identity as black girls.
You have to have permed hair, relaxed hair.
You know, straight hair or like blonde hair, you know, long waves or something.
And if it's natural, that's good hair. Like bad hair is hair you have to relax because it's kinky.
Like it's not like appealing to have like natural hairstyles, or like if they are natural, they have to be like the curly head like black girls or something that looks mixed or something.
And I remember when I first started wearing my hair natural, at first my mom was okay with it. And she thought it looked nice. And then after like the second day, she was like, oh, stop that. She was like, you're starting to look African. I was like, well, I am African. And that really pissed me off.
There are standards that are imposed upon us, like, you know, you're prettier if you're light-skinned.
I knew people in the past that wanted to be light-skinned, not for any particular reason, you know, because they love themselves. I mean, they love themselves except for, you know, the color of their skin.
Like, my siblings are all lighter than me, and my mom, she's dark-skinned, but she's lighter than me. So, like, I noticed, and I was like, hey, how come I'm the darkest? And, you know, everybody else is so light, and I don't know. Since I was younger, I also considered being lighter as a form of beauty, or, you know, beautiful than being dark skinned. So I used to think of myself as being ugly because I was dark skinned.
I knew people who actually like went out there and got, you know, bleaching cream and everything. They actually like laid in the tub, like poured like capfuls of bleach into it just so they could like see if their skin would get lighter.
But yeah, my aunt that lives in Honduras, she basically started using skin bleaching cream when she was about 25. And she started her oldest daughter on it when she was about 11. And then she has an even younger daughter that was about 6 when she started using the skin bleaching cream on her.
I've seen people say that I would never marry a dark-skinned man because, you know, because I don't want that in my gene pool.
I think you can imagine how incredibly difficult it might be for some of these girls to have to try to reconcile how it is that they are being expected and being judged on whether or not they live up to the beauty ideals of, say, a Beyonce. And again, let's make sure that we're really clear before we go any further. There is no judgment here with regard to whether or not anybody, black girl, white woman, whoever it happens to be, if they want to make a decision to have relaxed, long blonde hair, that's their prerogative. And that's not the point of this argument. But You might imagine that preferences for perhaps having long, relaxed blonde hair come from celebrities like Beyonce who take this on themselves, and this in part has seeds that are connected to the traditional idealized beauty norm of blonde white women that's been perpetuated literally for centuries in US popular culture. Not to mention the long-standing historical preferences and tensions between dark-skinned and light-skinned black persons, given the legacy of slavery and the related intimate violence that occurred as a result of it. Now, all of that being said, you can imagine that being a young black girl in US culture will provide a number of really important obstacles and challenges, and this is just on the level of one's appearance. This isn't taking into account all of the other kinds of important intersectional challenges that anyone is going to face. Now, many of these arguments with regard to the important power differentials between dominant and non-dominant cultural groups and the ways in which those in non-dominant cultural identity groups are often compelled to have to live their lives with certain kinds of challenges in order to try to negotiate the ideals and norms of a dominant culture for whom it wasn't designed, that's going to be resonant for a fair number of people who are watching this video. However, it's important to recognize that it's fair to guess that most people watching this video are really not necessarily going to have a real strong personal resonance with any individual example like this one from the Davis film, because that's just not a lived experience you've ever had. And so it's not anything you've ever had to think about. This is why grappling with the concept of privilege is really important. When we think about privilege, according to the classic article by Peggy McIntosh, privilege is a set of unearned assets that provide members of a dominant identity group power and advantages relative to other groups. Now, as soon as we start talking about privilege, especially then when privilege gets attached to things like race, when we're talking about white privilege, or gets attached to gender when we talk about male privilege, things start feeling uncomfortable and defensive immediately. So let's first deal briefly with what privilege is not, so that we can allay some misunderstanding. When we're talking about privilege, privilege is not an individually intentional act. If you possess white privilege or male privilege, for instance, this is not something that you intended to do. This is not a choice that you made, and therefore have to feel as if you are the fault or the cause of it. It doesn't work that way. At the same time, privilege is not a guarantee of individual comfort or prosperity. Many people, when initially grappling with the idea of white privilege or male privilege, often respond to themselves, well, I'm not privileged. I don't have a comfortable, rich lifestyle. My parents are working class, and I've had to work really hard for everything that I have. That may entirely be true, and that's not the point. Being privileged is not the same thing as being in a comfortable or prosperous position. They're different. Privilege is not, as well, an unfounded theory or opinion. And it's not an accusation based on reverse racism or reverse sexism. One of the most helpful ways, I think, to understand how privilege works is to think about a key story that was shared by the late David Foster Wallace, an author who delivered the commencement address to Kenyon College in 2005. The story goes something like this. One day, there were a couple of fish that were swimming along and enjoying their day. And at one point, an older fish comes swimming up from the opposite direction and says to them, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And then the old fish just kind of goes on his way. They swim a little bit further, and then one fish says to the other fish, "What the hell is water?" And then they swim away. The idea here being that if you live your entire life in water, you're not going to recognize the water. Think about the last time you really actively contemplated the importance of air in your day-to-day life. Now, every now and again, if we're talking about something like air pollution or climate change or the environment, the idea of the air that surrounds us becomes salient. But except for those very specific topic-focused moments, you don't think about air almost ever, right? So the idea is that just like water is absolutely essential to the lives of fish, even though they don't even recognize that they're swimming in it, privilege operates the same way for those who have lived their entire lives with it, never having to think about it. Because you don't really think about and label and analyze something that you can't even see and hasn't ever really occurred to you. The way that privilege works is that it's something a person can benefit from due to in-group status that those in out-group status can't. And as well, privilege can be protection from a problem that a person can have due to in-group status that those in out-group status can't. So, for instance, when you think about white privilege, these would be some brief examples. These are things that I never have to worry about because I'm white. I can find lots of children's books about people who look like me in every public library in America. I don't even have to think about it. I don't have to work hard. I'll go to the library. I'll find something. Similarly, I can easily find dolls that look like my daughter at any store. It's never a thing. I can walk around in an affluent neighborhood without arousing suspicion. I can apply for jobs and not have my name result in my resume being discarded. There's actually some fascinating research studies that have been done that resumes that are absolutely identical on the surface when it comes to job experience, the school attended, and the GPA, and everything on the merits are exactly the same. But if one name is a quote-unquote white-sounding name and the other name is a quote-unquote black-sounding name, the white resumes get looked at in far more frequency than the black-sounding names, which tend to be discarded. I can drive an expensive car at the speed limit and not be stopped by the police. There are countless numbers of black persons who have been stopped by the police because they're driving a car that the police officers don't think that they really should be able to afford. Or maybe they're driving that car in a largely white neighborhood. Or they may be driving that car at night. Now, as a white person thinking about these things, well, this is just not something that happens to people like me. And if it never happens to me, I never have to think about it. And never having to think about and deal with and negotiate these problems, while other people with different skin colors and different racial identity do have to deal with these on a daily basis, well, that's a significant advantage that I have. I didn't ask for it. I didn't do anything to create it. It's just something I get that I didn't earn. Similarly, as a man, if I'm in a bad mood or behaving emotionally, no one will blame it on my gender. I can be promoted at work without being accused of trading on my looks or sexuality. I can be viewed positively for sexual promiscuity, something that almost never happens for women. I can decide to start having kids with my partner without ever risking my employment status. Whereas women attempting to get a position of some status in many companies are going to have to work really hard to get past the pay gap and other obstacles because of the underlying assumption that, well, if you're a woman, you're going to need to leave your job for a while in order to have that child, and that's something the company is going to suffer a loss from. I never have to think about that as a man, even though I'm going to be putting forth lots and lots of effort potentially in raising that kid. And of course, I can generally ride an elevator or walk home alone at night without fear of being assaulted. As a man, I don't have to worry about any of these things, whereas women do have to worry about each of these things all the time. That's a privilege that I have that women don't have. I didn't ask for it, I didn't cause it, I just have it, even though I haven't earned it. So, when we think about privilege, it's a source of power created and maintained by social systems controlled by dominant groups over many years. This is something that is institutional. It's structured into the way the society is organized. And it's a source of power that members of dominant groups benefit from, even if they weren't personally involved in creating it. Now, given the significant social and cultural consequences of privilege imbalances, power imbalances, and gaps that lead to significant inequalities and injustice, how do we respond to privilege as a dominant group member? An important place to start, of course, is to acknowledge that the privilege exists and how we benefit from it. There's really not a whole lot of point to denying that you have white privilege if you're white, or you have male privilege if you're male, because all of the empirical research evidence, and indeed all of the anecdotal life experiences you've had, once you stop and think about it, establishes that you have it. So there's no point in denying it. Acknowledging that you have this privilege and you benefit from this privilege is an important initial step. The next step, of course, then, is to accept responsibility for this privilege. Here's where a lot of folks get caught up. When folks talk about issues of privilege and accepting responsibility, one of the first knee-jerk responses that those in a privileged position often have is that they're being blamed, that somehow they are at fault, and somehow I'm being accused of causing something that I never caused and I had nothing to do with. And that's not the point at all. Most of us, most of the time, that exist as members of dominant identities aren't necessarily personally responsible for the power imbalances and the inequities and injustices that occur. That being said, we benefit every single day from privileges that we didn't earn and other people can never have, at least the way in which our society and cultural dynamics are currently comprised. So even though we're not the cause and we're not to blame, we have to accept responsibility for this privilege, because since we've been benefiting from it our entire lives, if something's going to happen, we really need to be ones that do something about it. If not, then essentially we're taking benefits without doing anything to earn them, and that's just wrong. We can also learn about how power and privilege maintain inequality. And indeed, this isn't always about, and often it's not even usually about, overt racist behaviors and practices by individuals. This is not about how you as an individual treat other people, but it's about the larger social structures and the ways in which social institutions intersect with cultural identities in different ways. If we learn about how systems are set up in ways to benefit some groups and to exclude other groups, we can have a better understanding of how we got to this problematic condition of inequality in the first place. And once we have a better understanding of it, then we can take steps to help dismantle it. And this doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of being a full-time social activist and working tirelessly every day to enact new public policy. This can take the form of speaking with your friends and family members about these kinds of issues, calling people out when they engage in practices that might be identified as racist or sexist, and to call out the products of structural and systemic racism and sexism when we see it. And of course, the good news, especially for communication students, is the ways in which we're able to engage in this acceptance of responsibility, to learn about how these processes work, and the steps that we can take, both large and small, to do something productive to make things better for everybody. Much of this important work happens through the processes of communication, and particularly exercising that intercultural communication competence that recognizes and accepts one's own cultural identity and social position, and also tries to take the social and cultural identity of others we interact with into account from an open and accepting standpoint. That's the only way that we'll be able to embrace cultural differences as something that truly enriches our larger community, rather than have it be something that continually divides us and sets us at odds with one another. If you've got any questions at all about this video or the other videos in this series, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.